Good afternoon. I'm Liz Voiles. Welcome to the Center for Election Innovation and Research webinar, Election Denialism in America. You will hear about CEIR's new poll and focus group, which explore the state of voter confidence in our country today. First, you will hear from CEIR Executive Director, David Becker. He is also the executive director of the Election Official Legal Defense Network and co-author of the book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. We are recording this webinar. You can ask a question at any time in the Q&A box. After David reviews the findings, he will then answer your questions. Thanks again for joining us, and now we'll hear from David.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is actually the first one of these webinars we've put together, and we hope to do a lot more in the future about pieces of research that we're putting out about the overall state of our democracy and election administration. I should also mention I'm joined by CEIR's research director, Kristen Sullivan, who's here as questions come in, particularly questions that might get really into the details about the polling, which she knows better than anyone. So with that, let's get started, and I'm looking forward to your questions after we get through the initial briefing. I run the Center for Election Innovation and Research. It is a 501c3. It is a completely nonpartisan nonprofit. We work with election officials all over the country on both sides of the aisle to support their work to make elections that voters should trust and do trust. And one of the challenges we've seen in the last several years is while election officials have done a remarkably good job on the should trust aspect of that work, our elections are more secure, transparent, and verifiable than ever before. We clearly need to do more work on the do trust side of that work, particularly in light of some of the attacks on the election system that we've seen over the last several years. So we're going to be working with election officials, again, all over the country, both parties, to ensure that voters in confidence in our election system rebounds from what we've seen in the last several years. We can go to the next slide, Liz. We did a poll just this past December of over 2,000 registered voters all over the country. We oversampled voters in 6 states: Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. This follows up on a poll that we did about a year earlier about voter confidence to try to see if things had changed, especially in the aftermath of the 2022 election. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to move to another event that we took part in, a focus group of individuals who had serious doubts about the election of 2020 and 2022 in Phoenix, Arizona, back on February 13th, just a couple of weeks ago, which was incredibly informative and hopefully laid some groundwork, perhaps with some baby steps, to restoring confidence overall across the political spectrum. And I do want to say, when we get to that, Frank Luntz, the longtime Republican pollster, was the person who put this that event together. We'll talk about that a little bit. We can go to the next slide. So first of all, let's get to the good news. We saw that confidence overall, and particularly Republican confidence of the 2022 election, was significantly higher than Republican confidence was in 2020. That's a good sign. We want to respect that. But as we dive into the numbers, there's also some reason for continued concern. I should say that the fact is that the 2022 election was also incredibly secure, transparent, and verifiable. There were multiple recounts, there were multiple court cases. We sit here several months after that election, and there still has not been a shred of evidence presented to any court anywhere that would indicate that any of the races were compromised in any way, or that the results weren't accurate. And that includes races where Republicans won and races where Democrats won, even when the margin was extremely narrow. Many of you might know, for instance, the Arizona Attorney General's race was decided by a margin of, I believe, around 210 votes. But that was that was reviewed multiple times and recounted and audited, and that result was confirmed. And sometimes there are just close elections, which is why confidence in the process is so important. We can go to the next slide. This gets into some of the details on that confidence. So if you can see what we're looking at first, the first two columns are elections in your community. Next two columns are elections in your state. And the last column is elections in the US. I'm going to start at the far right. Let's look at in the United States in 2020, when we polled voters in 2021 about this, 57% overall had confidence in outcome of elections in 2020, but only 32% of Republicans did. In 2022, those numbers both went up significantly, and that's a very good sign. But what we'll see as we move to your state and your community, confidence goes up as you get closer to home. That's understandable. That's also true in a lot of other areas of public polling and relating to government. For instance, people will often say they don't like Congress, but they very much like their member of Congress. That's not unusual. And so we see a similar impact here. They're familiar with the election process in their own communities, in their own states. And as you get to the rest of the US, they're just not as familiar with those processes. And so that creates a situation where doubt can fester, particularly amongst those whose candidates might have lost. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, that Republicans, because the Republican candidate lost the presidential race in 2020, had much less confidence than others. But it is cause for some sigh of relief that the numbers overall are improving, and that hopefully reflects an overall restoration of confidence in the United States and in the entire elections process. We can go to the next one, I think. So we asked people about the reasons they might have concerns about the security of elections in the United States. And again, we saw a pretty big dichotomy between the overall responses and Republican responses here. Republican responses are in red, overall is in gray. And the one thing to note as we go down here, every one of these, with the exception of the bottom one, Republicans had far more concerns than voters overall did. And it's also important to note that most of these concerns are concerns that are not non-existent. These things all do happen to some degree, but we also know that the incidences of these happening are very, very rare in every state. So I'm going to go through them very quickly just so we can talk about them. People voting who are not US citizens, this happens rarely. It is caught, it is prosecuted. One very, very easy way to get deported from the United States is to fill out a voter registration application under penalty of perjury or cast a ballot when you're not a citizen. It is a crime that no one would choose to do because you're only gaining one additional ballot in an election in which, for instance, 160 million might be cast, and you're going to run the risk of deportation in addition to criminal penalties. But it sometimes occurs, probably mostly by accident, and states do a good job of detecting that and prosecuting it. People illegitimately voting by pretending to be someone else, again, this almost never occurs. It probably occurs rarely. With none of these, the incidences are zero. They do occur, but they occur rarely. There are multiple protections against these, and when that happens, these are investigated and prosecuted. People voting more than once, this does happen. We have a really good handle on how often this happens, thanks in part to tools like the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is sometimes called ERIC, which 33 states are members of. After elections, what they do is they share information on who voted. ERIC matches that and informs them about people who potentially voted twice, cast ballots in more than one state. And those states investigate it and they prosecute it. We see multiple press releases and referrals to prosecutions. And those numbers are usually in the dozens nationwide, not in the millions, but in the dozens. But it's not a major problem with regard to elections. People submitting too many ballots and drop boxes on behalf of others. Again, this has been investigated thoroughly. It does happen occasionally. When it does, those people are investigated and prosecuted appropriately when it's against the law in those states. People stealing with or tampering with ballots, again, non-zero numbers of incidences. They are detected, they're investigated, they're prosecuted. Voting machines or computers miscounting votes. This very rarely happens. And one of the reasons it rarely happens is because, and we know it rarely happens, because we have more paper ballots and audits of those paper ballots than ever before. We'll talk a little more about that soon. But those audits of paper ballots, what they do is they detect whether or not, those are hand audits. Those are people counting ballots and then comparing them to how the machines counted. And what they'll do is they'll discover whether or not the machines miscounted, either because of a malfunction or because of some kind of cyber event. And we have not seen any significant incidences of that. That doesn't mean we should not be vigilant and continue to do auditing of those systems. We absolutely must, but it happens extremely rarely. The next one is one that actually happens, or at least happened, pretty significantly in a recent election: foreign interference in election systems. In 2016, there were at least one and perhaps a couple more voter registration databases that were infiltrated by foreign adversaries. And it's clear that, because we've had a thorough chance to review it, that this did not impact the election. It did not affect voter registration records. They were probably doing reconnaissance within those systems. But it does happen. It can lead to distrust even if they don't change anything. One of the things CEIR does is every 2 years we put out a report on voter registration database security, because that is a legitimate concern for the states. And we just released one earlier this month, which you can find on our website. And in fact, what we found is that consistently states have done a better and better job of increasing the security around their voter registration systems to prevent and detect any kind of interference in election systems. Election officials intentionally miscounting votes. I have not seen this yet. Election officials are incredibly diligent. They really uphold their oaths of office. This is true whether they're conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats. It's true whether the candidate they voted for won or lost. I don't know of any instances of these, but as you can see, there is more Republican distrust in that rather than compared to overall. Election officials accidentally miscounting votes. This could happen, particularly accidentally reporting a bad count. Sometimes there's a situation like what happened initially in Antrim County, Michigan in 2020, where votes were input into a spreadsheet and reported out with a mistake in them, and that was corrected almost immediately, I believe within 24 hours. But that never affects the certified results. It's something that happens extremely rarely, again, thanks to the diligence and hard work of election officials nationwide and to the transparent process pre-certification. The last one is one that was unusual because overall the concern was higher than Republicans, which is voter suppression of minorities. There are legitimate concerns about whether there are attempts to suppress minority votes. There may be some states where this occasionally happens. And I certainly, as someone who used to work in the voting rights section of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, I'm very attentive to that. But I will tell you also, we've seen record high turnout and record high minority voter turnout in the last two major federal general elections, and that's a very good thing. I think in the overwhelming majority of states, minority voters, like all voters, have better access to the system, more access to online voter registration, automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, more access to mail ballots if they choose to vote that way than ever before. And that's a really good sign. So, I think overall people should have confidence about that as well. And you can see there's some disparity again between the overall and the Republicans in that part of the survey. We can move to the next slide. Thanks. So we also asked voters about solutions to this. And here you'll see that we don't have an overall. This is red is Republicans, light blue is Democrats, and kind of the purple in between is independents. But you can probably get a sense of what the overall view is by looking at these three. With voter ID verification, this is overwhelmingly popular. We didn't define it. These things can be defined very differently in different states. And so this is not a policy prescription by any means, and I'll talk a little bit why that isn't, but it just does give a sense of where voters are on the broad ideas of these things. Republicans prefer voter ID verification more than independents and Democrats, but as you can see, they're all significant majorities there. Transparent vote counting for the public to see, again, widely popular, not much variation, which is a really good sign between Republicans, independents, and Democrats. Regular cleanings of the voter rolls, taking dead people and non-residents off the lists. Again, overwhelmingly popular, slight preference for Republicans compared to Democrats with independents in the middle. Increasing the number of hours and days in early voting. Majorities of Democrats and independents like this idea, but very close to 50% of Republicans do too. This is a fairly popular idea. Expanding access to vote by mail. Here's where we start seeing some major disparities. Large majorities of Democrats, about half of independents, and only about a quarter of Republicans support that. And then finally, automatically registering all eligible citizens to vote. This is, again, approved by a majority of Democrats, about 2/3, and actually close to half of independents and Republicans, with just slightly under that. One thing I want to stress about all 6 of these policy prescriptions is many of these are happening in literally every state, and others are increasing in many of the states. So for instance, voter ID verification is in the vast majority of states. I believe it's 35 or more states that require some form of voter ID. And that doesn't even count the states, which is all of them, that require a match to voter ID to register in the first place, because that's part of federal law, and verification of mail ballot applications and mail ballots when they come in, which happens in every place that offers mail ballots. Transparent vote counting for the public to see. Every single state allows observers during the vote counting process, during the review process. That is something that is consistent across all the states. Regular cleaning of the voter rolls is required by federal law. Every state does it. Some states do it better than others, like those 33 states in the Electronic Registration Information Center, but every state does that. And it's really important to remove ineligible voters because people have moved away or they've aged out of voting, as I like to say. Then the bottom 3 are all things that we're seeing increasingly adopted in states. We are seeing more hours and days of early voting available to voters in many states. That is a trend we're seeing consistently in red states and blue states. Some of the states that offer the most expansive early voting opportunities are red states, quite frankly. Ohio famously offers weeks and weeks of early voting opportunity. Expanding access to vote by mail, again, that's a trend we're seeing nationwide. And that doesn't necessarily mean moving to all mail balloting, as some states have done, but just to allow for, as many states have done, anyone to request a mail ballot for a particular election. That's how it's done, for instance, as a relatively new law that was passed in 2019 in Pennsylvania. And then automatic registration is something that is happening not only in blue states, but also in some red states. And states like Georgia have implemented a very effective automatic voter registration system that we will be issuing a report about later this year. Next slide. So you can go to electioninnovation.org. You can find the full poll results. Every question, all of the results, all of the crosstabs are available there. Feel free to check it out. We do likely plan on doing more of these to see what the trends are and seeing whether voter confidence is improving or not. And I do want to suggest, first and foremost, that the credit for voter confidence improving really lies first and foremost with the election officials, the people all across the nation, the secretaries of state, the lieutenant governors, the state boards of election, the county election officials, even down to the people who volunteer to be poll workers, who've really made that their life's mission to increase voter confidence. So we at CEIR and a lot of people all around the country give them our thanks for that. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this focus group that I participated in 2 weeks ago. It was put together by Frank Luntz, and it was surrounded some of the issues that were brought up in the book that Major Garrett of CBS News and I wrote, The Big Truth, which is right back here over my right shoulder. Hopefully many of you have read it or will go out and buy it. But it's what we wanted to do, and this is an idea that Frank had along with professors and staff at the at USC and Arizona State University's Cronkite School of Journalism, was to bring a group of skeptics about the election together with experts such as Major, Garrett, myself, and we had Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger from Georgia and Maricopa County board member Bill Gates, both Republicans there as well, so that we could talk about what we've seen and also address any concerns they have and answer any questions. It lasted 2 hours. I will tell you, we weren't exactly sure what to expect. We thought that it might be hard to get some of these people to speak about it. I do want to say these people were incredibly brave to share their thoughts in some ways, because they were surrounded by students from the Cronkite School at ASU. They had us up on the stage. They knew their views were going to be challenged. They knew their views would likely not be popular in that forum. And they spoke very, very freely. And I think I encourage you all to watch the video of this. The full video is available, and a shortened version of it is available as well. And what you'll see is it was a really civil, thoughtful discussion where people felt free to express their views. And I'll be the first one to admit, I'm not sure that we changed any minds instantly that night. But what you won't see on the videos is everyone stuck around afterwards. They talked with us. They took copies of the book. They asked for us to sign it. I had one of the members of the focus group come up to me afterwards, and he asked me if we were going to do more of these. And I asked him, do you think it's worth doing more of these? And he said, oh yeah, we should definitely do more of these. And that really gave me it really kind of lifted my heart about the possibility of reaching out to people as citizens across this country, because he had just sat through 2 hours of his views being challenged, and he still wanted to do more of that, given, as long as it could be a civil, thoughtful, open discussion, which I think you'll find if you watch it, it certainly was. Why don't we go to the next slide, Liz? Thanks. And you'll see this is, it was based on the book. We talked a lot about the things that were in the book, but we also got into some of the very, very specifics of, in the book, we didn't talk about the 2022 election. It came out before then. And a lot of people in Arizona had doubts about the outcome of that election, which was very close. For those of you that live in states, and there are more than ever, where margins are going to be very narrow, it's really hard often to process the idea that the candidate that you preferred, that you really believed in, might have lost a close election. Certainly that's something all Americans are familiar with. We've all had that happen. And so, talking about that in the context of Arizona and what had recently happened there, and specifically in Phoenix with Arizona election officials, Georgia election officials, again, going back to that polling question, people had less confidence in elections outside of their own state. So we wanted to have someone like Brad Raffensperger there to also address their concerns. And it was really instructive, and I hope people get a chance to watch it. It wasn't easy for any of us, but it was something that I think we need to do more of, putting ourselves into kind of uncomfortable positions, engaging with our fellow citizens in that way. Liz, you can go ahead to the next slide. There's kind of what the event looked like. I should just say it was a really nice venue at ASU at the Cronkite School. And again, the courage and willingness to engage of the members of the focus group, as you can see, they're kind of in the inner half circle there with us up on the stage with Frank Luntz. And then all around were largely students from ASU and the Cronkite School who were attending. And they actually asked some questions, really good questions, and participated, which gave us some insight that polling really can't give us, that we really got a chance to kind of delve down into some of the things that these people believed, a lot of the disinformation that had been fed to them, and hopefully open the door for more dialogue on some of these issues. It's one of the questions that came up was there was a point in time where one of the focus group members mentioned that he had a member of Congress that he really trusted, and he really liked this member of Congress. And it happened to have been a member of Congress who objected to the electoral count in 2020. And I asked him if he thought that member of Congress was legitimately elected to to Congress in 2020 and 2022. And you could see he almost had, he took a moment to kind of take a step back and think about that, because he was elected on the very same paper ballots that candidates that he didn't prefer won the presidency, and then 2 years later, the governorship. And he expressed doubt about all of the elections of all the candidates. And what I hope that everyone thinks about is who benefits if that's the case? Who benefits if we all doubt any elections in which our candidates lose? Because it's certainly not we, the American people, who benefit from that. We don't get good governance from that if we doubt the authority of those who are governing us, even if we didn't vote for them. It's really our adversaries, particularly autocracies overseas, who benefit from that doubt. And hopefully we can see that and start uniting as a country to prevent some of those things. We can move ahead. So we're going to move ahead to some of the key points. These are talking points that we raised during the focus group. They are probably not surprising to any of you, facts that are that have been confirmed and reconfirmed over and over and over again. But it's helpful sometimes to see them summarized. So I'm going to go through them really quickly here. Next slide. So I want to stress, and we do talk about some of this in the book, or most of this in the book, we have more paper ballots than ever before. These are paper ballots that the voter has actually seen and verified before putting them into a machine for counting. 95% of all votes in 2020 and 2022 are cast on paper, including in all the battleground states. The only states remaining with significant electronic votes are red states, are states that were won significantly by Trump. And I'm not suggesting that there's a slightest bit of evidence of any kind of problem in those states either. There isn't. But the more we can move to paper ballots, the more we can demonstrate conclusively that the machines counted the ballots correctly, the ballots that the voter themselves cast. I mentioned the audits. Those are hand audits, matching batches of ballots to the counts that the machines had. We're doing that now in 43 states in DC, and that number is growing, and those audits are getting better every single time. You know, most famously in Georgia, where they counted every single presidential ballot 3 different times, 3 different ways in 2020. Those were all paper ballots. Compare that to 2016 in Georgia, where they had no paper ballots at all. They had switched systems between the 2018 and 2020 election, and they couldn't audit their ballots that same way. So they did a remarkably good job in 2020 of ensuring that they could demonstrate that those ballots were counted appropriately. We had more pre-election litigation clarifying the rules of the election than ever before. That's definitely true in 2020 and in 2022. And in 2020, over 85% of those pre-election cases were won by Republicans. You know, I think that's something that's not often discussed. It is entirely appropriate for people who think they have a legitimate legal claim against some of the rules that are implemented pre-election to bring those claims pre-election and seek court review and clarification of those rules. What is not really justifiable is waiting until after you lose and then complaining about rules that you knew about prior to the election. Election officials have a hard enough job as it is. They need clear rules, and those rules have been resolved pre-election. And most of the time lately, that's been resolved in favor of the Republicans who brought those cases. And then, of course, the post-election litigation, which we've seen more than ever before, over 60 cases. We sit here now, we are 848 days since the 2020 election, and there has not been a single piece of evidence presented to any court anywhere that would indicate that the election wasn't properly determined. In fact, reviews continue to confirm that it was properly determined. That's true for 2022 as well, although not as many days since then. As you can see from the last bullet there, you know, one of the things that I think has really come out is the knowledge of the Trump campaign in particular, that they had lost, that he had an opportunity, his campaign had an opportunity to have statewide recounts in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in 2020. As you might recall, Jill Stein requested and paid for those statewide audits in 2016. Recounts. Those recounts confirmed the results in 2016. It's likely that those recounts would have confirmed the results in 2020 as well. But Trump declined those statewide recounts, even though it was his right to do so. And this kind of goes to the next slide, Liz. which is that we're starting to get more and more information that the Trump campaign definitely knew that they had lost. Certainly his own cabinet, his own White House counsel, his own campaign staff, and his own family was telling him that. And we just recently found out that they paid a research firm to investigate these claims, and they came to the same conclusions before even the joint session of Congress, before the insurrection on January 6th. So, this is coming out more and more, and I'm sure most of you are following the news that's coming out from the revelations that are coming out from the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News, that we're seeing more and more that it wasn't only the Trump campaign, but it was also at least Fox News and journalists there that knew these claims were without merit at the time that they were being broadcast. So certainly that hopefully can lead to correcting some of the effect that disinformation has had on so many American citizens. And I also want to stress here, I think this is really important, and I think you can tell this if you watch the focus group. There were tens of millions of people who voted for the losing presidential candidate in 2020, and they are not insurrectionists. They are not criminals. They are good American citizens who preferred a candidate who lost. That happens in every election, and we need to engage with them as such. And it's unfortunate that they've been targeted for so much disinformation. They've been targeted for people who are trying to keep them donating and angry, rather than focusing on, actual election administration issues. There's always ways we can improve. So we're going to, I think, hopefully continue to try to engage with people and treat them as the good American citizens they are, regardless of who they choose to vote for, and work towards, even increasing the security of elections as we move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. We're going to move now to the Q&A, where you can ask David questions about what he's just told us. We ask that you enter your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. Those are two different things. And then I'll read it out loud and David can answer. So our first question is from Judge Thomas Griffith. I think we should probably go back to the slide that this refers to, but he asks, do 32% of Republicans today believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen, or does that figure represent what Republicans thought about the 2020 election in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. My recollection is on this poll, we focused on the 2022 election, and we focused on the 2020 election on a previous poll. Kristen, can you confirm whether I'm right about that?
Yes. So this visualization here actually is looking at how well people thought elections were run and administered. So what we found is that in 2021, 32% of Republicans said they believed the 2020 presidential election was administered well. And by 2022, 38% of Republican voters said they believed the 2020 election was run and administered well.
Right. Did we ask in 2022 what people thought about the 2020 election?
Right. So this question here, in 2020, we were asking about views on the 2020 election. Yes.
So wait, I want to be clear here. The 2020 columns here were based on our prior survey that we asked in 2021, correct, Kristen?
That's right.
In 2022, we did not ask a second question again. Did you think that the 2020 election was run well? We didn't ask that a second time in the second survey, did we? That's the question Judge Griffith is asking.
We did, yes.
And what does the 2020 column numbers reflect here? Do they reflect us asking that question in 2022 or 2021?
So that's the 38% that I mentioned.
I'm not quite following, but I think we'll move on to the next question. Liz, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So the next question comes from Manuela Lee. Has there been any talk about implementing biometric technology, such as fingerprints, to help with the validity of the votes?
So There's been talk about biometrics for a lot of years. One of the things that we first have to understand is there are multiple points at which voters are verified. They're verified at the point of registration. If they vote by mail, they're verified when they request a mail ballot. When they return that mail ballot, they're verified at that point as well before that ballot is counted. That is, and most of the states do it by signature matching, but some of them do it by driver's license number, like Minnesota and Georgia. So there's multiple points of verification. In addition, there's over 35 states that have some form of voter ID where voters in person have to show voter ID before they cast a ballot. Look, the problems, this is a longer conversation I won't get too far down in, but in order to be able to verify identity through biometrics, you need to have a database of everyone's biometrics. And we don't have a national citizen database in the United States. We're one of the few countries that don't. We have a decentralized system. There are pros and cons about that. There are many people who feel very strongly we should never have a federalized database of that information. There are many people who think we should. I'm going to put that issue aside. I think that's a broader issue. But you can't confirm someone's identity through biometrics unless you have a source for all of those biometrics. They need to reside somewhere. So that's a whole separate issue. I think that's something that even if it were decided to be a policy priority, that we'd be probably probably several decades away from getting to that point.
The next question is from Jeff Greenberg. This is an interesting one. He's asking if the beliefs of some election skeptics have become hardened to a point where it's not worth using energy to persuade them. Do you have anything to say about that, David?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And it's something that honestly, there's a lot of internal discussion about. And one of the things I've seen is that it's not as easy to say that, there's a group of people that are, that are just hardcore election deniers who are never going to believe reality and how big that group is and who those people are. The focus group really informed some of my knowledge about that. I think there's a lot of people who are reachable on these issues. I should also state that election denial is not just the province of only one side of the political spectrum. There have been doubts about elections, certainly in 2016 from some on the left. Those were also unfounded, but they were not at all the same in terms of the scale and scope as what we saw post-2020. So this is not a moral equivalence. This is something, it's not 50-50. It's just not 100-0 here. So there's seeds of election denial in a lot of places. I think we need to continue to engage as much as we can in good faith. We certainly need to respect the bandwidth. One of the things I hear from election officials around the country is there is no ignoring the effects of the disinformation on their work, because every single day they have people coming to their office, sending them emails, making phone calls, and that's the constructive individuals. There's some making threats and harassing election officials as well, raising points of disinformation. It's sucking up their bandwidth. It's making their jobs very hard. It's chasing election officials who are really good, both Republicans and Democrats. In fact, it might be more Republicans facing this than Democrats right now, being chased out of office. We're seeing disinformation that's leading to some really poorly thought out policy prescriptions, like moving to hand counts, which are less accurate, more costly, and take much longer than machine counts, trying to get states to do a less voterless maintenance, trying to move states away from joining the Electronic Registration Information Center or leaving the Electronic Registration Center, moving away from things like drop boxes, which are honestly, if you have mail ballots, the most secure way to return them, because you don't have the Postal Service middleman. You have them dropped off in a drop box, which really only means that the voter and the election officials are touching that ballot. So I think there's no way that we can just ignore what's going on out there. We're going to have to continue to fight disinformation with the truth and to give election officials all across the country the tools they need to do that.
We got a question from Carrie Roosh asking if we could share the link to the focus groups, and I can put that in the chat, and then we can also follow up with an email with that link. That's no problem for everyone. The next question is from Jay Richardson. If voter ID check would become a requirement for every voter in every election, do you think this would cause any kind of unintentional voter suppression?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a concern, and I think it depends on what voter ID looks like. There are several jurisdictions, red and blue, that require some form of ID. Usually, it's a variety of different forms of ID that are I think very honestly trying to raise confidence in the elections, but also make sure there's way that they don't accidentally disenfranchise someone who legitimately might have a challenge getting some of those IDs. Jurisdictions like that, and there are several, often have an alternative to an ID. If you, for some reason, you don't have your ID, you can sign an affidavit swearing under penalty of perjury that you are who you say you are. And I know from states like Michigan, what often happens is they'll only see a tiny number of these affidavits. Most people do have IDs. I am not expressing an opinion on voter ID as a good thing or a bad thing. But as long as there's an alternative where a voter who legitimately doesn't have an ID can still cast a ballot, that's fine. I mean, I'll tell you, the Clinton administration pre-cleared a law like that in Louisiana in the 1990s, because even if a voter didn't have ID, those few that didn't have ID, they were still going to be able to cast a ballot. And if there was fraud, they would have that affidavit, which would enable them to investigate that fraud. And they virtually never found any fraud in that sense. It is a legitimate concern with some of the ID requirements that are out there, where you're seeing limits on IDs, where you're seeing for instance, gun licenses and fishing licenses be okay for ID, but not student ID cards, where there's a requirement that a very small number of IDs would be necessary. Otherwise, there's no fail-safe whatsoever, and a voter would have to cast a provisional ballot and come back within a short number of days after the election with one of those forms of ID, which they might not be able to get. And most voters will not return after an election to the election office. It might be miles away and inconvenient to get to. Those are the kinds of things that I think there are legitimate concerns about unintentional, or even at times perhaps intentional, voter suppression. I will also say, I think those who are intentionally trying to suppress votes in states because they think it's going to lead to outcomes that help them, they're going to be sorely disappointed, because what often happens is intentional voter suppression rarely actually leads to the electoral outcomes people want. And in general, passing policy just because you want to see a particular partisan outcome in an election usually doesn't work very well, because voters are very, very complex and respond to a variety of things. Perfect example is we just had the highest turnout we've ever seen in American history by a large margin in the middle of a global pandemic. That certainly doesn't mean that global pandemics lead to high turnout.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Ryan Ronco. Are you polling in areas where election deniers have been recently elected or appointed to election administration positions? And if so, are you seeing any changes to your poll numbers in those places?
That's a really good point. We did oversample in the 6 states that I mentioned. In those states, I would actually suggest that election deniers, at least at the statewide position, I'm talking about places like Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, have not been successful. There have been some success in some places in counties, for instance, in Arizona and Nevada, and we haven't done enough polling with large enough numbers to granular level data in those county levels. But Ryan, by the way, for those of you listening, is one of the very best election officials in the country and the state of California, and California is very lucky to have him. I will tell you that it's a really good idea, and it might be something we look at in subsequent polls as we're seeing some of this play out. We didn't oversample California, but there are certainly counties in California where there are election deniers who are leading movements away from practices that are really secure. I mentioned, trying to get things like hand counts, trying to get switches to election technology that are not based on any kind of evidence or data or facts, trying to get states to do less list maintenance of their voter lists. Those are the kinds of things we absolutely should keep an eye on. And I'll hopefully see you, and maybe we can brainstorm about that for future polling, because I think it's a really good idea.
Okay, next question is from Jay Richardson. What do you think of the Australian voting laws where there is a national holiday and everyone is actually required to show up at the polls? Would this ever be viable in the US?
So I'll say briefly, I'm going to remain agnostic on how other countries, particularly really well-established democracies like Australia, votes. Although for those of you that might know this, our ballot, the way our ballot is set up, is called the Australian ballot, with a lot of races on it like that. It's actually it derived from the way ballots were used in Australia a couple centuries ago. But actually, ballots in Australia look a lot different than ours. They're shorter. Almost every ballot in the world is shorter than the American ballots. I think most of you on this webinar probably recognize when you go vote, if you're getting a pre-printed paper ballot, particularly in a presidential election year, you're probably seeing something that's multiple pages long with dozens of races on it. And so that takes some time probably to prepare yourself and review. I will tell you, whether it's a good idea or not to move to a model just like Australia where people are required to vote. It's very unlikely to be passed anytime soon on a national level. It may be passed in some local races at the local or state level. It's something that's being considered, certainly worth experimenting with. I think one of the other things I'd mention really quickly is the idea of a national holiday for voting, which is something that many advocates have supported. And I will tell you on the record, I am not a big fan of this idea. I think the solution to the challenges we might face in encouraging more access to the vote will not be solved by encouraging more people to vote within a concentrated period of time on a single day. I think that leads to more challenges. We've actually solved this problem. The problem is solved by actually spreading voting out over a variety of modes and methods over several days. And the states that do this really well offer easy access to no excuse mail balloting, offer easy access to early voting, whether it's 4 days or 14 days or 24 days. That varies by state, but as long as there's some access to early in-person voting, that's really important. And then election day voting also needs to be an option for many people who prefer to vote that way. But the simple fact of the matter is, even if election day was a national holiday, think about what happens on national holidays. Schools are closed, which means that many voters might have challenges with childcare when they might otherwise vote. Often, public transportation runs at reduced schedules, which might make it harder for people who rely upon public transportation. And oftentimes, people who are hourly workers are incentivized to work because they might get paid time and a half on national holidays. So it might actually hurt people who it's designed to help. Where what we really need to do is give voters options so that no one is forced to choose to vote within a single 12-hour period on a Tuesday in November, but rather can choose a variety of other options that might be convenient and fit their own personal schedules.
Okay, just a reminder that you can ask any last questions of David in the Q&A box. Just going back a moment to Kristen's answer to Thomas Griffith. So she writes, we did not ask about the belief that the election was quote unquote stolen. We did find that in 2021, 32% of Republicans said they believed the 2020 presidential election was administered well. By 2022, 38% of GOP voters said they believed that the 2020 election was administered well.
So, Judge Griffith, the key here being that the metric that we measured in 2021 went up a small amount in 2022, but probably not overly significantly. I mean, it does appear that the resistance to the belief that the 2020 election was run well, which I think could reflect your view of whether or not the election outcome was viewed to be stolen or not, didn't significantly change, although there was slight movement in a positive direction when we polled about it a year later.
Okay, we have another good question from the prolific Jay Richardson. Timeliness of publishing election results enhance confidence in elections. Why do California elections seem to take so much longer to announce final results?
So we have to first reflect on something that election officials all know, which is there are no final results on election night, ever. There are no final results on the day after election day, ever. In every single state, it takes days and usually weeks to certify and confirm the results and make them official. We only think we know who won elections before that certification is done, because the margin of victory is larger than the amount of ballots that are still outstanding than we can count. And that's the basis upon which the media reports out that they can call a race, and that makes us think that an election has been decided. This is something election officials have a real challenge with, because as we get elections that are close, it's going to take a long time to count ballots. It is true, however, I will say, and I say this as someone who's a Californian and a proud Californian, California does take longer to count ballots than almost anyone else, but they don't take longer to announce results. Think about election night in a presidential year. California is called at 8:01 p.m. Pacific time because the margin is going to be so huge because of California's electoral dynamics that we know who won the election in California, even with very few ballots, thanks to exit polls and other information that might inform that. The margin is just going to be huge. However, we do have a lot of really close races in local races and in congressional races. And this is something that California taking a long time to count ballots. Look, if it's close race, it's just going to take a long time for us to know who won these races, even as they're getting to certification. If you have a race like the Arizona Attorney General's race, which is decided statewide by 210 ballots, or the Washington governor's race in 2004, or the Minnesota Senate race in 2008 between Franken and Coleman, or of course the famous 537 vote margin in the Florida presidential race in 2000, there really aren't any laws that can get you to a final outcome sooner than what happened, because every single ballot is going to count in those margins. It is the one variable that election officials have no control over, and that largely dictates whether or not voters think ballots are being counted fast or not. I will also say, though, there are some things that states can do that aren't controversial to allow for faster counting of ballots. And one of those things is the pre-processing, or what some states call pre-canvassing, of mail ballots as they come in, which is the verification of all the information on the outside of the envelope prior to election night, so that those ballots can be loaded up and tabulated immediately upon the close of the polls. Pennsylvania doesn't allow pre-canvassing or pre-processing of mail ballots currently. Wisconsin doesn't allow pre-processing of mail ballots currently. Michigan only allows it starting the day before the election. Those things need to change, because that is a way to get some of these ballots counted faster. And I know a lot of the election officials around the country, Florida allows pre-processing, Georgia allows pre-processing, most other states do. It is a best practice that can get us to that final number faster.
Okay, our next question is from Tommy Gong. Where do you see the sources of election denialism in 2020, and what can be done about it going into 2024?
Yeah, that's a great question. And since I gave a shout out to Ryan Ronco, I'll also say Tommy Gong is also one of the best election officials in the country, also from my home state of California. So a lot of California folks on here. So it's really hard to detect the sources here. And I don't have direct knowledge of who some of the people are who are pushing out the election denialism, the disinformation. It is clear where some of the profits are going, and I would suggest there is an ecosystem of grifters, and there's no other word for it, who are profiting a great deal. You know, whether it's Sidney Powell, whether it's the Trump campaign, whether it's a pillow salesman, whether it's others, they are out there, and the people who follow them, every time they get an email from them or something on social media, it's accompanied by a fundraising plea. And they're getting rich. They're lining their pockets with small donations from people who have been targeted, people who are sincerely and understandably disappointed in the outcome of the 2020 election, whether you agree with them or not. And they are fleecing their own flock. They're getting rich off of it. And this is why, without identifying more people out there, there are others undoubtedly involved. And again, it would be speculation. I think this is why accountability is so important. 2023 is going to be a key year for this. To get past this, we're going to need to see accountability on the criminal side. whether that's in Fulton County, Georgia, or New York City, or from the Department of Justice. We're going to need to see accountability from the civil side, and we might see that in the lawsuits against Fox News and others. And we're going to need to see this from the professional side, where people's, for instance, bar licenses are challenged because they misrepresented themselves to courts, or they violated their oath of office as an officer of the court. I'm a lawyer. I know what that oath of office means. I take it very seriously. Almost all lawyers do. But when you withhold evidence that exonerates people who you're publicly saying should be under investigation, when you make misrepresentations to the court, where you allow false representations to be presented to the court as evidence under penalty of perjury, those are certainly things that state bars need to be taking into account, and hopefully will, because ultimately I'm not so much concerned about who's doing it, but I'm concerned about the effect on people who are actually giving voice to the American voter, people like Tommy and Ryan and the tens of thousands of election officials all over this country, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats.
All right, David, those are the final, we've answered all the questions in the chat box, the Q&A box. Do you have anything you want to say to close us out?
No, just boy, the questions were great. I really appreciate all of you being on. For those of you, I've seen some familiar names in here, especially the election officials, excuse me, who are on this. Thank you for all that you do. Just scrolling through this, I'm already seeing Republican, Democrats, election officials, people who've worked so hard to make sure that elections are run fairly and securely and give voice to their voters. If you're not an election official, find your local election official, volunteer for them. Honestly, give them a hug. They probably need it. And thank them for their work, because their job has become harder than ever, and they are still getting it done every single day.
Great. Okay, we have one last slide, which is just how to keep in touch with CEIR. If you would like to be among the first to receive new research from CEIR, and they have some that's going to be coming out very soon, sign up for the newsletter at electioninnovation.org/press. And then follow David and CEIR on Twitter at electioninov and Becker David J. A lot of times, David especially responds to developments in real time on Twitter. So that's it. We hope that we'll see you on the next one of these. And thanks again for joining us.